This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. We turn now to the harrowing scenes of paramilitary-style units in the streets of American cities like Portland, Oregon, where heavily armed federal agents with no agency markings have snatched people off the streets, forced them into unmarked vans. The developments have shocked mainstream America. This is MSNBC host Brian Williams.
Overseas, if we saw these pictures, we'd call it something like a military junta. Under a Mussolini or a Pinochet, we would make nothing of it. It would just be a Wednesday.
Just be a Wednesday, but the violent presence of federal border agents is not unfamiliar to many black and brown Americans, especially those who live along the border. The brutality now seen on U.S. streets is also all too recognizable to global communities who have faced the terror of U.S.-trained military forces, sometimes death squads from Iraq to Kenya to Guatemala. The scene unfolding in Portland, Oregon, has also drawn comparisons to U.S.-backed death squads that terrorized Latin America for decades. For more, we're joined by two guests. Cecilia Menjívar is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where she focuses on state and gender-based violence in Central America and immigration enforcement in the U.S., originally from El Salvador. Also with us, reporter Todd Miller, who's covered border security and immigration for over a decade. He's the author of Empire of Borders, the expansion of the U.S. border around the world. Also author of Border Patrol Nation, dispatches from the front lines of Homeland Security. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Menjívar, let's begin with you. If you can respond to what's happening in Portland, Oregon. As you heard Brian Williams say, I mean, this may be familiar to others. He talked about Chile, he talked about Mussolini, but here in America, you know a different picture of this country, and also back to where you came from, in El Salvador, intimately connected to the United States, especially in the 1980s, sadly, through soldiers, often U.S.-trained soldiers, carrying weapons that might come from the United States.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the questions, because what is happening in Portland and probably in other cities in the United States was, as Brian Williams said, the order of the day for most of Latin America during the 1970s and 80s. And for instance, the image of an unmarked van taking people from the streets and taking them who knows where, it brings back memories to Latin Americans who lived through disappearances of families and friends and co-workers for a long period of time. So this is something very familiar, very close to Latin America, so throughout the region, because these were strategies of state violence and state control that were implemented throughout the region during the military dictatorships of the 70s and 80s.
Well, I'd like to bring Todd Miller into the conversation. Todd, you are the author of a book called Empire of Borders, the expansion of the U.S. border around the world. So could you talk about that specific, your subtitle, the expansion of the U.S. border around the world, and then specifically how the role of the CBP changed after 9/11?
Sure. In terms of the expansion of the U.S. border around the world, even thinking specifically about the specific force that was in Portland and the BORTAC unit of the U.S. Border Patrol that was pulling people off the streets. Over the years, during my doing research, I've come across them on several occasions, and on one occasion was in Guatemala, and I was going to a military base to meet with a commander of a new border patrol force that they were forming there. And my whole purpose of going there was to see that how much the United States was behind that the creation of that border force. And so I got there late, but I tried to convince the soldiers at the gate of the military base if to if I could still meet with the commander. And while I was waiting there, one of the soldiers came up to me and asked me if I was from Bortak. I went, what? And they said, Bortak. And I couldn't believe my ears, really. Bortak. Hardly anyone in the United States even knew who Bortak was. But here I was, 1,500 miles away from the U.S. southern border, a soldier in Guatemala who knew who Bortak was. I got the meeting with the commander, and the commander then verified that Bortak had been there. The U.S. Border Patrol had done trainings there. That the United States Embassy funding was behind the creation of the new Border Patrol, and this one's called the Chorti in Guatemala. And that was just one example of many examples of this expansion of the U.S. border abroad, this what they call externalization, or the extension of the zone of security, if you want to use the kind of state speak that's being used. And Guatemala is one example of, much to my surprise, over 100 examples in countries all over the world where the U.S. Border Patrol, specifically Bortak even, are going and doing trainings, sending resources, creating border patrols, teaching other countries how to patrol their borders, and this whole idea of pushing out the U.S. borders. So, and according to how the mission of stopping people from coming to the United States long before they get to U.S. shores, and this is something that's been happening for quite a while. It's been happening for decades in many ways. During in the 1980s, in fact, you could go back to documents of INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, going to Mexico and saying, "We'll stop people coming from different countries in Central America from crossing the Mexican border." And so that's an example of how far it goes back. But the programs really shifted post 9/11. There's really a huge emphasis put on this extension of the border, and you could really see where the core of this comes from the 9/11 Commission report. In the 9/11 Commission report, there's one quote in particular that's really revealing, and it says, "The American homeland is the planet." So the idea that the American homeland is everywhere, and thus there's the underlying logic of this expansion of the United States going to over 100 countries and using the same units that are now found in Portland, Oregon, or possibly in Chicago today, or in other cities around the United States.
What gives these federal agents, Todd Miller, and law enforcement agencies so much power? You've got Portland, Oregon, which falls within 100 miles of the border with Canada. You've talked about these constitution-free zones and how it relates to border security, both the North, the South, but now Trump is saying he's sending it to, well, many cities where there are Democratic mayors, particularly women and women of color who are mayors.
Yes. So the Bortak unit they're essentially U.S. Border Patrol agents. And the U.S. Border Patrol agents, as you just mentioned, Amy, they work in what are known as the 100-mile zones, or as the ACLU put, constitution-free zones. So if one can imagine, the contours of the United States, right, along the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, the 5,000-mile U.S.-Canada border, along the coast, and if you imagine a band, like an orange band or something like that along the contours, that is covering a huge chunk of the U.S. population. 200 million people are covered in what is known as the Constitution-Free Zone, where the U.S. Border Patrol works with extra constitutional powers. And in that sense, where on the southern border, the idea of the U.S. Border Patrol agents snatching people off the streets, or snatching people in the desert, or snatching people in the various checkpoints that they can put up in these 100-mile zones, happens every day, happens all the time. In a sense, it's like the extension of that border into places like Portland or Chicago, but as you mentioned, fit within the Constitution-Free Zone, or the border jurisdiction. In Portland, close to the Canadian border, and also along the coast. So along the coastlines that's also in those sorts of jurisdictions. And then when you look at BORTAC, which is the Special Forces Unit of the U.S. Border Patrol, the ones that are doing the paramilitary-style tactics, they are the Border Patrol on top of the Border Patrol, right, in terms of being militarized, weaponized. They were formed in 1984 to quell uprisings in detention centers for the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And then they had a presence in 1992 in Los Angeles when there was unrest after the Rodney King incident. And it goes on and on. There's a long history of BORTAC being involved in unrest, and it seems to be part of their purpose. And so, as Border Patrol has expanded in astronomical fashion over the last 25 years, particularly 4,000 to 21,000 agents, the expansion of BORTAC then happens as well. And so, in a way, it's a surprise. It's quite a surprise, like the clip from Brian Williams. And then in a way, it's not a surprise at all to see that BORTAC is being a part of and being put in places where from Washington might view as unrest, right? Was really people protesting, that they're going to be showing up in Chicago, that they're going to be showing up in New York, in places that are in the 100-mile zones. And I want to, as people are quite aware of, there was an announcement in March that BORTAC, that's Border Patrol Unit, was going to join forces with Immigration and Customs Enforcement and ICE to do a show of force in the sanctuary cities, right? The sanctuary cities to then go after undocumented people in cities, the same cities where we're seeing them being deployed right now. So in a way, it's going hand in hand with what was announced in March, with what's been going on actually for years now.
Professor Cecilia Menjívar, if you could also talk about the state violence that's been deployed against immigrant communities along the border, and also what's been happening in detention centers where disappearances are routine often.
Right. Yes, my research has focused not at the border, excuse me, away from the border, but I was doing I was doing quite a bit of research in Arizona, in Maricopa County, during the time when the sheriff of Maricopa County used many similar techniques to terrorize the Latino population specifically. And at that time, I was interviewing Central American immigrants in the area who pointed me in this direction. They brought up to my attention the similarities between what they had lived during the civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador and what they were living in Phoenix during the reign of terror that the sheriff created in Phoenix, for instance. And so it was their experiences that brought to my attention the similarities between technologies of state violence and state terror used during the civil wars in Latin America and what Latino immigrants specifically were living in cities in the United States, specifically, for instance, Phoenix, where that concentrated. And in relation to detention centers and disappearances in detention centers, what happens to immigrants who are sent to detention facilities is that they are sent to very remote places. They often lose contact with their families. Their families don't know where they are. I have had immigrants calling me, asking me to help them locate their family members because they don't know where they are being held. And so this, again, brings back memories to when in their home countries, they would go search for families who had been taken from their homes at night or from their places of work to be disappeared. And so the same thing was happening here is happening here in the United States with 638 detention facilities throughout the country. Each state has at least 2 detention facilities dedicated to hold immigrants in detention. And so this is the parallels are so strong and so vivid that immigrants who have lived through both can very quickly point that out to one's attention.
I can only think, Professor Menjívar, I can only think about the words of Archbishop Romero as he did his last homily broadcast throughout El Salvador. March 24th, 1980, he was gunned down by a U.S.-backed death squad. And he was saying the words, to the soldiers of El Salvador, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression. Professor Cecilia Menjívar, professor of sociology at University of California, Los Angeles, and Todd Miller, author of a number of books, award-winning journalist, including Empire of Borders, the expansion of the U.S. border around the world. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Stay safe.